All right. Good morning, everyone. This is Brianna Gonsalves with the Community Technical Assistance Center, CTAC, and I would like to welcome you to today's webinar, Part 1, Trauma-Sensitive Schools, a Multi-Tiered Approach. Today's webinar is the first of a multi-part series titled In the Face of Adversity, Promoting Resilience Through Trauma-Sensitive Schools. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to orient everyone to the WebEx system so you know how to participate in today's event. First, please note that upon joining the webinar, you have been placed on mute to avoid any background noises that may distract others from listening to the presentation today. If you come across any technical issues during today's event, please chat to the host, which is me, and I'd be happy to assist you. You will have the opportunity to submit questions for the Q&A portion of today's presentation by utilizing the chat box feature, which is located on the right-hand side of your screen. If it's not visible, click the dialog bubble on the top right toolbar and it should appear. Lastly, in order to ensure that we are able to answer as many questions as time permits, we are requesting that you send in your questions at any point during the webinar, and we will address them during the Q&A portion of today's presentation. We are very excited today to have Dr. Jim Rodriguez, Senior Research Scientist at the McSilver Institute for Poverty Policy and Research with us today. Now I'm going to turn it over to Jim to get us started.
Great. Thank you, Brianna, and welcome, everybody. It's my privilege and pleasure to kick off this series. This series is being presented by the CTAC, and I've actually coordinated the series. I'm kicking it off, but I'm also going to be continuing to look for material. Towards the end of the webinar, or at the end of the webinar, I'll let you know of upcoming events in this series that have been scheduled. But I'm also going to be scheduling additional presentations in the series. And if at any point you get off, please do me the favor of completing the survey and noting any additional topics that you'd like to cover with regards to trauma-informed care in schools or trauma-sensitive schools. A little bit about my background. I am, as Brianna said, a senior research scientist here and a trainer here at the Community Technical Assistance Center. I'm also adjunct faculty at the NYU School of Social Work. I am a practicing psychologist and social worker. I'm licensed as both in New York State. And I have a lot of direct practice experience working in a school-based mental health program at the New York Presbyterian Hospital. I'm also in private practice, and I work here at the McSilver Institute, where the CTAC is located, in a program called Step Up that provides mentoring and group life skills training for young people at risk of dropping out. So I say all that because I come to this webinar and this series with a great deal of excitement, trying to spread the news and trying to get people interested in trauma-informed care in schools. So a little of our agenda today. I'm going to start off with some foundational knowledge and overview of trauma and ACEs, and talk about the human stress response in the brain and how it affects young children, especially, I should say not young children, children and adolescents. And then I want to cover resilience, understanding resilience and the role it plays in helping people respond to stressful life events, and a little bit of the research that's come out in that. Of course, there's much research on resilience. I want to share some of that. And then we're going to end by talking about trauma-informed care and schools, the principles of trauma-informed care in schools, and, as I mentioned, a three-tiered model for looking at trauma in schools. I want to be clear from the get-go that this is going to be sort of a comprehensive overview of trauma-informed care in schools in the next parts of the series, there'll be more discussions on specific interventions and strategies that can be used in school settings. But this is going to be more of an overview and beginning to look at the process of how you would transform a school to be more trauma-informed. I want to say a little bit about why this is such an important topic. First, trauma-informed care in schools is important because it's considered early intervention based on all the information that we've obtained and has been published on the Adverse Child Experiences Study. I put early intervention in quotes because oftentimes when we talk about early intervention, we think about young children and school-age children and interventions that focus on that group of children. But we don't often think about middle school children and high school children when we think about early intervention. And so one of the things, and what the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study has shown us is that the long-term effects of exposure to early childhood or childhood trauma can be widespread and serious for both social problems and health problems. And so when we think about early intervention, I want to think about, and when we think about trauma in schools, I want everyone to think about, of course, intervening from preschool to high school and sometimes beyond. The other reason why trauma-informed care in schools is so important is because more and more schools are being seen as an effective setting to meet unmet mental health care needs among children and adolescents. Increasingly, schools are being relied on, in many cases burdened, but relied on to deliver mental health services. And so looking at trauma-informed care in schools is critically important because of, again, the pervasiveness of trauma, and trauma being, in many cases, at the core of many of the mental health problems that kids may present with in schools. And then, of course, the other thing that's important to understand with trauma-informed care in schools is that by focusing on trauma-informed care, by focusing on resilience and the factors that promote resilience in young children, we can actually look at the things that help to promote educational attainment in schools. And that's something that's always been an ongoing struggle in school-based services, is this integration of both mental health outcomes and educational outcomes. I hope that by the end of this presentation, you'll have a good sense of how those two things are actually connected. So let's chat first. So please use your chat box. I just want to get some sense of what folks think a trauma-informed school or a trauma-sensitive school might look like. This both gives me an idea of where you're coming from, but also the knowledge that you have. So if you can just chat in, what would a trauma-informed school or trauma-sensitive school look like? What are some components? What are some things that would be critical in a trauma-informed or trauma-sensitive school? Okay. Yep. Okay. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of great comments here. Okay. Okay, these are some great areas. I think I'm going to try to see if I can highlight some here that are coming up, and some great points. I think I'm seeing suicide risk assessment protocols, recognizing the warning signs of suicide. I see de-escalation team, being able to respond to crises, critically important, and support groups that I'm not sure what specifically, but we will be talking about support groups for kids who've been traumatized, and working with parents as well. Really critical pieces. Safety planning, protocols for responding to emergencies in the room and crisis intervention, providing a supportive environment. Okay, great. Working with homeless and displaced youth, absolutely, that makes a lot of sense. Administration and staff should have some understanding of how trauma might manifest itself in children and adolescents. Absolutely, that's a critical piece when you're talking about a comprehensive approach, is how to get that buy-in from schools. Mental health providers, of course, the provision of mental health providers. Okay, these are great, wonderful comments, and these are sort of many great points that I think we're going to touch on. And I think as we move forward with this presentation, you'll see how many of these issues are very consistent with a trauma-sensitive or trauma-informed approach in schools. The trick, of course, is getting there. So let's start off by looking at children and trauma. One of the things that I want to highlight is that most of what we know, as I mentioned earlier, about trauma, and one of the reasons why we're talking about trauma-informed care more generally in behavioral health and trauma-sensitive schools today, comes from the ACEs study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. I'm not going to go into detail on that. We've done other webinar series on trauma, trauma-informed care, where we've covered extensively the ACEs study. I'm going to cover some research today from the National Study of Children's Health that uses ACEs questions to look at children's health now. But I think that in terms of looking at ACEs and its impact on trauma, we've done other presentations, and I don't want to go over that information again. However, I will say that what we know from the ACEs studies is that exposure to adverse childhood events, especially early on in life, has long-term consequences, as I mentioned earlier, for social and behavioral problems as well as health problems. And this is just a list of some of the things that early exposure to adversity is related to later in life. For those of you who may be new, although nowadays it's hard to find anybody who's new to ACEs, for those of you who are new, the ACEs study was done on over 17,000 participants, looking back on their early childhood experiences, but it was a study done at Kaiser, and they looked at health problems of adults and took extensive histories on their early childhood experiences and found that those early childhood experiences were associated with many of these outcomes that you see here today, that you see here on the screen. But I also wanted to highlight currently, so as a result of ACEs, actually, the National Survey of Children's Health added a module. So they're looking at children's health outcomes and children's health in general, and added an ACEs questionnaire to the study of children's health in general. They asked parents about 9 types of adversity that their children may have been exposed to, and what they found was nearly half of children currently in the study, newborns to 17-year-olds, almost half, 47.9%, were reported to have at least one of the 9 exposures. And about 1/5, 22.6%, had 2 or more. When you see this list, one of the things that I wanted to highlight from this is that this is probably an underreport. One of the things that you would note if you looked at these lists of adverse childhood events is that for obvious reasons, this was parent report data. So for obvious reasons, they took out the items from the original ACEs study on childhood abuse and neglect. However, on the other side, they did add socioeconomic hardship, and they added items like exposure to racism and discrimination. So in some ways, this is ACEs, but not exactly. It's somewhat different in terms of the items. Many of the other items, however, remain the same. Experiencing divorce, living with someone who had alcohol or drug problems, being exposed to domestic violence in the home. These were all part of the original ACEs study. So I want to highlight that, but as I said, when you look at this, in many ways, some things aren't reported in here that would also be obviously contributors to long-term stress and trauma, like childhood neglect and abuse. And I just want to sort of point this out. So when we think about the classroom and the school, based on that data from the National Survey of Children's Health, if we were to look at a typical classroom in America, and that was national data, if we were to look at a typical classroom, this is what you would have. You would have about half the class demonstrating 0 or no, or having no adverse childhood events or family events. And then you'd have about a half having either 1 or 2 exposures. One of the things that we talk about with trauma-informed care is understanding that in many ways, what we try to do with young people is prevent re-exposure to trauma, and oftentimes we don't know whether kids in the classroom have been affected by trauma. Of course, early screening and assessment is important, so we'll talk a little bit about that in terms of a trauma-informed approach in schools. But this just gives you an idea of how many kids, over half of the kids in the classroom, would be experiencing or would have the experience of some sort of adverse childhood event. Looking at that data, also what's critically important, and this is particularly for those of you who may be working in low-income schools or associated or having contacts with low-income schools, this is just the same data, the ACEs from the National Study of Children's Health. This is New York State data. So in New York State, if you look at this for families at 0 to about 99% of the federal poverty line, that's the FPL, so obviously a measure of income. You see the rates of 1 or 2 ACEs being 32% or 27%. You lump those together, and that number from 47 goes up to 59% in classrooms where families live in poverty. 48% for those within 100 to 200% of the poverty line. So you see, of course, that poverty plays a role and increases the likelihood that the number of children in a given classroom, in a given school, will have been exposed to adverse childhood events. And this is looking at same data, New York State data, and ACEs, and the relationship of ACEs to emotional or behavioral issues that may have come up. So in the National Study of Children's Health, they looked at EBI's reported rates of ADHD, anxiety, depression, ODD, as well as autism spectrum and developmental disorders. And so you see here, as the number of adverse childhood events increase, you see the likelihood that kids will have emotional and behavioral problems increases, 51% for those that have 2 or more ACEs. So obviously, adverse childhood events are going to be associated with emotional and behavioral problems. In addition, so this is also based on some data with the National Study of Children's Health. It's important to see that the rate of exposure to adverse childhood events is also associated with problems in school, engagement in school. So you see as the number of ACEs increase, the amount of engagement, motivation, and focus and attention decreases. And then here, the number of children, this is based on some data from Washington State that looks at adverse childhood exposure and academic problems that might occur. That's low academic attainment, dropping out, suspensions, expulsions. They all increase as a result of exposure to ACEs. So one of the things that's critically important in this work, and I realize that as we go through this material, this may be speaking to the converted. So as mental health professionals, you all understand the human stress response. This is a bit of a review, but one of the reasons why I bring it up here, as we'll talk about later, is that as someone mentioned earlier in the comments, one of the things that's critically important in this work is educating others on trauma and its effects. I'm going to talk a little bit about how that's been done, but also I think as mental health professionals, it's important for us to be able to prepare and have other people understand the impact of trauma. So very quickly, when we talk about the human stress response, this is our sort of hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And so when someone is exposed to stressful life events, toxic life events, their HPA axis is triggered, producing high levels of cortisol that increase those negative health problems. And so that constant exposure to traumatic events or stressful life events produces this human stress response and impacts the ability of the individual to regulate their emotions. So the person is prepared for fight or flight, off or freeze, and that constant exposure to stress and being in that flight or fight response is what often leads to stress. Of course, this stress response can be normative. It's actually necessary. But when someone is constantly exposed to stressful life events or traumatic events, it becomes difficult for the individual to distinguish between real threats and perceived threats. So that as we talk about often in the human stress response, it's difficult for someone to, this human stress response is important. For example, if you're in the woods and there's a bear in the woods, or if you're in the street and you have a car coming at you. But when you are constantly exposed to stressful life events, it becomes difficult to distinguish between a real bear in the woods or a car in the street and a teddy bear. And it's important to understand that fight, flight, or freeze response and how fight can be seen and can be demonstrated by, in children, by irritability, easy loss of temper and defensiveness. Flight, of course, anxiety and fear and numbing, and freezing can often be demonstrated by numbing or detachment. This is just some data showing cortisol levels supporting that human stress response and its relationship to traumatic or life adversities. So this is looking at cortisol levels, comparing middle-class toddlers with children who've been, and toddlers who've been maltreated or neglected, and you see heightened cortisol levels. And this is also some brain imaging studies that look at, similarly, that look at the brain functioning of children who have been abused versus those who are healthy. And as you can see on the right side, those children who've been abused or neglected have low activation in the temporal lobes, the areas of the brain, and also I should note in the frontal cortex and the prefrontal cortex, the areas of the brain that help people sort of make decisions, that are involved in executive functioning. So we see this in many of the studies that look at brain development. Later on, I'll show you pictures of what the resilient brain looks like. But what we know is that children who have been exposed have exposure to significant traumatic events, have difficulties regulating their emotions, have a sense of loss of safety and direction. They have an inability to detect or respond appropriately to dangerous cues, and they can be set off very simply by negative communications or reactions. It can lead to both exploding behavior, imploding behavior, and escape, engaging in activities like substance use, cutting, and other behaviors that young people use to cope with the difficulties of stressful life events. And then shutting down, the ultimate sort of form of and reaction to stressful life events. And so the severe effects of trauma, these are some of the effects of trauma that I've just sort of gone over: self-harming behaviors, hallucinations, hypervigilance, somatization, aggression and rage, suicidality. These are all of the very many outcomes that we see that are coping mechanisms for dealing with stressful life events. One of the things that's important to review in terms of trauma and stressful life events, and for people to understand, for lay people to understand especially, is that, you know, we think about sort of three forms of traumatic exposure: acute trauma, which can result from exposure to a single overwhelming event, a natural disaster, a sexual molestation, the death of a parent. But then when we think about, and that's usually what people think about when they think about stress and they think about its relation to PTSD. But oftentimes, I think, again, through ACEs and the research that's been done on ACEs, that's highlighted the other forms of trauma or toxic stress that young people can be exposed to that can have many similar effects to the effects of acute trauma. Just as a reminder, PTSD in children only has a short history in terms of the literature. For a long time, people didn't realize that young people could be exposed to trauma and have PTSD-like symptoms. And as I said, as a result of ACEs, now people are coming to the realization not only that they can be traumatized by events, but also chronic stressors. And then, so looking at chronic stress and toxic stress through adverse childhood experiences is really critical. And then, of course, complex trauma is exposure that involves repeated and chronic exposure to childhood events that oftentimes occur within the primary caregiving system. These are kids who've been highly affected by trauma through, again, abuse, neglect, incest, and many other severe forms of trauma that lead to all kinds of complex symptoms and disorders. And then to return, again, as we sort of went over earlier, the effects of trauma and on learning and behavior are clear. For those children who are exposed, it affects concentration, memory, and cognition. It reduces the student's ability to focus and organize themselves and problem solve. But I think one of the bottom lines, I think when we talk about symptoms and disorders, we sometimes lose sight of the bottom line for the effects of trauma. And these are sort of less understood, but clearly sort of hallmarks and foundations of trauma. And those are estrangement, a sense of disconnection from others and the environment. Young children who've been, or children who've been exposed to trauma and adverse childhood events often feel disconnected from the environment that they're in. Feelings of powerlessness and helplessness that comes from a lack of control because of the abuse that they've experienced, but also a lack of control over their own memories and thoughts and emotions. It also involves a change in the self-concept and understanding. These are those core beliefs. One of the things that trauma does is it affects an individual's core beliefs, not only about themselves. So many people who've been exposed to trauma and stressful life events develop core beliefs about themselves, that they're unlovable, bad, dirty, or unworthy. But they also develop these core beliefs about the world around them, that it's an unsafe and scary place, that people are unreliable. And people who've been exposed to trauma also obviously have devastating fears that results from that loss of safety and trust. And then lastly, the feelings of shame and guilt and stigma that in many ways result from all of the above. So I want to turn to resilience. One of the things that is important to understand with regards to trauma is the flip side of the coin from trauma, which is resilience. What is resilience? Why is it important? So again, just briefly, for you all on the call, please chat in. What is resiliency? Please chat a brief response. For you all, what are the key aspects of resiliency especially in young children? Ability to overcome trauma, the ability to function, to bounce back, to overcome, grit, is a growth mindset to persevere, the ability to cope every day, inner strength, the ability to take in hardships and work through them and cope to be successful. I see protective factors, perseverance, being able to move forward. Okay. Thank you for those responses. One of the interesting things I see in those responses is that many of them, I saw a couple that talk about protective factors. Many of them focus on the individual. One of the things that's critical to understand with regards to resilience, well, let me start off by talking a little bit about the history of resilience. Sorry, I'm having a little difficulty advancing slides here. Give me one. Okay, sorry. So a couple of things I want to say about resilience. First, these are just some topics and some quotes that I want to share with you. The beauty about ACEs is that though the outcomes are accurate and predictable with no intervention, there's a tremendous amount of hope with intervention. This is a quote from Jim Sporlater. I'm going to talk a little bit about, he was the principal at Lincoln High School, a well-known high school. A movie was made about it called Paper Tigers. And he talked about this. I'm not sure if I would use the beauty about ACEs necessarily, but the point that he's trying to make there is that because we know, and this gets at Robert Anda's quote. Robert Anda was one of the co-investigators of the ACEs study. What's predictable is preventable. One of the things about ACEs that's incredible to understand is, unlike some other disorders, and many of the disorders associated with ACEs, I would include under this, are knowable. If we know that someone's been exposed to trauma, then we can, and we know the predictable outcomes that come from that, then we can prevent it. And that prevention can include a number of at a number of different levels, which I'll talk about later. Sometimes we might not be able to prevent the exposure, but we can prevent the negative outcomes if we focus on resiliency. So what is resiliency? First off, I just wanted to sort of give a little history. There's been research done on resiliency since the 1970s. The early work focused on kids that were living in families that had parents with schizophrenia. And obviously parents of children of parents with schizophrenia have many poor health and mental health outcomes. But they were interested in the subgroup of children of schizophrenic parents who were actually surprisingly healthy. The early work with these kids focused on individual attributes, including autonomy and charisma. But they also found that external forces to the child were also at play, the family and the larger social environment. But early on, these kids were actually almost seen as invulnerable. That they were super kids in some ways. What they actually found, though, is that resilience fluctuates over time. It's not permanent. So what we know about resilience is that it fluctuates, as I said, over time. Children might demonstrate some strengths in one area while demonstrating significant deficits in another. So, for example, the silent sufferers who might demonstrate good academic skills but poor coping skills that lead to depression and anxiety. So researchers started looking at other factors that might be associated with resilience. And now, in general, resilience is kind of seen not as an individual trait that can be measured, but actually adaptation to coping. So many of you actually touched on this, but the definition is positive adaptation despite significant adversity. And I highlight significant adversity because many of the researchers who look at resiliency focus on the importance of that significance. This is why I say the flip side of trauma and adverse childhood events, or understanding the impact of trauma, is understanding resiliency, because we're not talking about, with resiliency, we're not talking about garden variety difficulties, failing a test, or having difficulties with a relationship. We're talking about the kinds of adversities that are outlined in ACEs. So it's good developmental outcomes despite these high-risk statuses. It's sustained competence under stress. It's recovery from trauma. And so it's this trying to find normal development under difficult conditions. This is, as I mentioned earlier, a resilient brain. So what this brain scan shows, this was research done. Now, I will say this was research done with adults, with adults, but I want to highlight that one of the things that they did with adults was expose them for 6-minute periods to very stressful images and to non-stressful images. So what they found in terms of people responses to those stressful images was that there was activation in certain areas of the brain. And that this increased and then decreased activation after the stress response. And so after they exposed them to these stressful images, they asked them about their histories. So this was just, everyone was exposed to the stressful images, then they got history, and in many ways it was like the opposite of the ACEs study. They got a history on their coping styles and what they've done, and what they found was that risky coping, folks on the right-hand side, those were folks who had histories of negative coping, of difficulties in coping using drugs and alcohol, problematic behaviors. And resilient coping on the left were people who had better, more appropriate ways of coping with life. And so what they saw in the two differences is that people who are resilient in coping have activation in those frontal lobes, that when they are exposed to stressful life events, they're already thinking about how to calm down, how to relax, how to deal with the situation. People who are not resilient don't have that level of activation in the prefrontal cortex. How resilience develops, it's best understood as transactional and contextual. This is why schools and understanding trauma in schools is so important. So it's transactional, it's multidimensional. There are a number of different ways in which in which individuals can develop resiliency, and it can be expressed in multiple domains and areas of functioning. The goal of intervention is always to help the person who's gone through those difficult life events to mobilize their resilient capacities through relationships. So one way of looking at the research on resilience, a recent article in the APA Monitor, the American Psychological Association Monitor, was summarizing the data on resilience, and what they found was a few things. With regards to children, social emotional learning increases resilience. Durlak and his colleagues did a meta-analysis of social emotional learning curricula like Castle Learning, and they found that those interventions were highly successful in building resilience, defined as emotional control, goal setting, perspective taking, and problem solving. In addition to that, researchers also found that treating maternal mental health problems and improving parenting helps to build resilience in young children. So when you help parents deal with their mental health issues, it has a trickle-down effect to young children. That is, of course, owing to the importance of relationships in the lives of children in order to build resilience. And another interesting study on therapeutic foster care was an intervention that was done with foster parents raising kids who were in foster care, obviously children who had been abused and neglected. And what they actually found was that those in the experimental condition, those who were the foster parents who had gotten therapeutic foster care, training on how to raise children, training on parenting skills, supports, and then also some interventions for the children themselves, actually had more appropriately, leveled off cortisol levels, both in children and adults. That both morning cortisol levels were comparable to kids in the comparison group, what we would say typically developing kids or normally developing kids. And the reason why that's important is because it's beginning to show, neuroscience is beginning to show that, that interventions focused on building resilience can have an effect at the neurobiological level. And then research also has shown that looking back on people who have demonstrated, the Kauai study that was done in Hawaii looked at not only individual characteristics like self-efficacy and self-regulation, but the importance of at least one supportive adult to help overcome adversity. So these are many of the factors. When we take all of that research into account, what we know about resiliency is that it does involve individual assets, things like self-control, self-efficacy. But there's also the importance of significant others, and then systems, significant others being adults like obviously parents, but teachers as well, mentors, and then systems and culture, schools and communities that can be supportive as well. So, trauma-informed care in schools. When we think about trauma-informed care, many of you addressed this earlier. There are three pillars of healing. One is creating safe environment. Two is creating connections and beginning to build those relationships, and helping young people manage emotions. Those are the three things that we can try to focus on that help build resiliency within a trauma-informed environment. These 6 principles of trauma-informed care are important to understand. This was put out by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration of the federal government, and they've identified these 6 principles that are important. Safety. And when we talk about safety, we're talking about creating a safe physical environment, ensuring that all contacts are safe and and appropriate. That includes everything from greetings to quiet classrooms. The importance of safety is, the bottom line is, doing no harm. Trustworthiness in schools can be demonstrated to a school-wide commitment to trauma-informed care, a commitment from all, including teachers, staff, students. And then peer support. Oftentimes we think about peer mediation in schools, but also peer support for parents and providing support to parents. Collaboration, getting adults and students to recognize that trauma-related symptoms and behaviors originate from adapting to traumatic experiences. So in many ways, it is getting everybody on the same board about the importance of trauma. Empowerment, giving young people voice and choice. And the other piece that's critically important is understanding the impact of cultural, historical, and gender issues, understanding the isms. One of the things that's been missing in trauma-informed care that I think people are paying a lot more attention to now is the importance of racism, sexism, ableism, xenophobia, how those things can be consistent with exposure to toxic stress, and the importance of addressing those in a trauma-informed approach. So this is thinking about the traditional view of treating students versus the trauma-informed view. It's moving from understanding that students don't choose behavior, students choose behavior and they need consequences, to the belief that students want to do well but lack coping skills. The traditional view characterizes students' behavior negatively as manipulative. In a trauma-informed approach, they're viewed as constructive, needing calming strategies, moving beyond labels, and reframing behavior to identify strengths, moving beyond authoritarianism to a collaborative approach. So these are all different ways in which the common and traditional view of how we view children in schools and their behavior switch in a trauma-informed approach. So this is the three-tiered approach. When we think about trauma and we think about the important features of a trauma-sensitive school, we have our three-tiered system. For those of you who are kind of conversant and have a history of understanding of positive behavioral interventions and supports, PBIS, this three-tiered model might look a little familiar. So when we think about the universal prevention programs or primary prevention, what we're thinking about is inoculation. All students get it. These are universal screening strategies, identifying kids who have been exposed to traumatic experiences, and also identifying kids who are symptomatic. But this can include creating safety in a variety of ways. Creating safety can be created by anti-bullying campaigns, training teachers on social and emotional learning strategies that can be implemented in all classrooms. The use of meditation and relaxation in the classroom, calm classrooms, quiet time, mindfulness practices in the classroom that can help everyone in the school, regardless of whether they've been exposed to trauma or not, learn strategies to help regulate their emotions and calm down. Research that's been done on the calm classroom, you can look it up. The calm classroom is an approach that, and much research has shown the impact of relaxation and meditation. But when the calm classroom, and again, you can look this up and see the program that's available. You see improvements in standardized test scores, reductions in school violence, decreases in school suspension, and teachers reporting less stress. One of the things that's critically important to understanding with the trauma-informed approach is that we're not only concerned in the trauma that children experience, but also the secondary or vicarious trauma that the caretakers experience. So one of the things that's critically important is focusing on teachers as well. A comprehensive trauma-informed approach includes taking care of teachers. Some of the things that clinicians can do, educate. So somebody mentioned earlier, a trauma-informed approach would include administrators and staff and teachers understanding the impact of trauma. As mental health professionals, you can engage in professional development activities on ACEs and trauma-informed care, teaching self-care to adults, teaming and collaborating with mental health professionals in the school, facilitating organizational self-assessment. I have a couple here that are available, and I won't go into them, but there are many organizational self-assessments that have been developed, both in general for behavioral health, but also for trauma-sensitive schools. This is an example of a trauma-sensitive schools checklist that can be used to help guide schools through organizational self-assessment. And then, oh, sorry, gosh. Oh, I'm sorry. So these are some of the domains of organizations and organizations that are trauma-informed. So again, supporting staff, creating safe physical environments, establishing supportive environments, and you can see all of the different ways in which these can be implemented in schools. Moving up to the middle tier, selective programs, aka secondary prevention. This is for kids who need it. This is for kids who are experiencing some difficulties. Some examples of selective interventions include cognitive behavioral intervention for trauma in schools. It's a group-based model that is trauma-focused, and a similar intervention called support for students exposed to trauma sets, and then also restorative justice and discipline practices. The reason why I mention these two is because in part 3 of this series, Aram Nadeem will be talking about CBITS. In her presentation, we'll be talking about the critical components of trauma treatment, as well as these kinds of group interventions. And then at the intensive level, this is for kids who are having serious problems associated with traumatic exposure. These are for kids who have severe mental health needs. Some examples of interventions include trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, but other evidence-based treatments that deal with the different kinds of presentations that kids might have in relation to trauma. So moving away from just looking at trauma as PTSD, it's important to look at other kinds of evidence-based approaches, those that focus on parents, so parent-child interaction therapy, implementing those. Now, those are all difficult to implement necessarily in schools. However, collaborative partnerships with resources in the community that have access to those kinds of trauma treatments are important. And then also at this level, sort of trauma and mental health focused child study teams, collaborating with child study teams, and partnering with school-based health clinics and school-based mental health centers that provide more intensive services to kids that are critically important. These are all things that that schools can do. I'm going to sort of go through this very quickly so that we can have time for questions. But there's a case study for those of you who are interested. So going back to education, one of the things that that you all can do is educate folks on trauma. There is I mentioned earlier, a movie called Paper Tigers. And in Paper Tigers, it's a documentary of a school in Walla Walla, Washington, where the principal went to a talk on trauma-informed care, or excuse me, he went to a talk on ACEs, and based on the ACEs research, he decided to make comprehensive changes in his school, in the policies and procedures, but also the way they dealt with kids in the school. It was an alternative high school. And some research that was done, it was a minor evaluation, but they looked at these cycles, looking at these cycles of work in the school, and what they laid out was this sort of intervention model where when they thought about safety practiced by staff and teachers, that of course decreased trauma triggers. They implemented values and looked at values, hope, teamwork, focusing on healthy emotions, treating kids with compassion and respect, moving from what did you do to what happened to you. That leads to greater articulation of behaviors, quality relationships, and then of course increases kids' learning. This is some of the work that they showed when they took a trauma-informed approach based on the ACEs research. They showed huge improvements and decreases in suspensions and expulsions. Written referrals went down. They showed also increases in graduation rates and kids who were college-bound. This was an alternative school with some very impacted kids. So that is sort of a model. As I said, in the coming presentations in this webinar series, we will have Elise Capella talking about universal interventions that clinicians can use in schools to help consult with teachers. But let me take a minute to take some questions and see if I can answer some before we end. Sorry that we're a little behind, but...
Jim, thank you so much for that presentation. I'm going to suggest that people still submit questions. I'm going to take note of who is submitting questions, and what we can do is we can follow up via email with a response to questions that come in. Is that okay, Jim? Does that sound good?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I'm going to pose the first question. We'll probably only be able to have one now, but someone asked, should children be aware of ACEs and how this may be affecting them, and if so, at what age?
So that's a great question. Going back to actually the documentary I was just talking about, Paper Tigers, if you see that documentary, and actually I would recommend that you see it, but that you also share it with others in your school if you're at the high school. Again, that was a high school, and one of the first things that they did actually was talk about ACEs. They talk about, one of the things that you'll see in that documentary is they ask kids to report. It's a teacher asking kids to report on the number of ACEs. He actually lists the ACEs out and asks them to report how many they were exposed to. That's pretty blunt and that's pretty difficult to do, obviously. But one of the things that they pointed out was being clear about the importance of trauma. So yes, I think depending on the age, first off, of course, regarding trauma treatment, it's important to talk about psychoeducation at all ages, young children and older. So one of the things that we know about trauma is that you need to go after the trauma. I've worked with many young children and treated many young children with trauma, so clearly talking about trauma with young children in a developmentally appropriate way is critically important. That's one, obviously, when it's known. But yes, educating even young children on trauma and its impact is a critical part of treatment.
Great, thanks. So we are now close to out of time, so I'm just going to move on to the next slide with upcoming events. Jim mentioned these already. You can visit our website, www.ctacny.org, to register for these events. You'll find it underneath our upcoming events tab on our website. And I just wanted to take a second to also say that the webinar slides, the checklist, and the organizational assessment will be uploaded to our website as well in 2 to 3 business days. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody for joining today's webinar, and thank you, Dr. Rodriguez, for taking the time to open up this series with us.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.